So, welcome everybody to this iteration of Taking It From the Top. We are joined by special guest Dr. Chelsea Shanoff. She is someone that is near and dear to my heart because even in my early training, she's someone that I looked up to tremendously from a performance standpoint. She holds degrees from the University of Toronto and Arizona State University and is just an incredible advocate for musicians' wellness, and I'm so glad that she could be with us on the show today. So, thanks for joining us, Dr. Shanoff.
Thanks, Jeff. It's really weird to have someone call me doctor. I've honestly never been introduced that way. It weirds me out a bit.
Sure. I have the same thing. Like whenever people introduce me as Dr. Leung, it's always just like it's okay.
Yeah. It's like
Yeah, but I just wanted to make sure that we acknowledge this monumental achievement at the University
Thank
of
you.
Toronto that you have, and the topic of this segment is continuing this conversation on musicians' wellness. And I was wondering if you could give us a brief overview of how that's looked like in your practice, because I know that yoga for musicians has been a great part of your life, and you've also are moving on to studies in occupational therapy. So could you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll try to give like the Coles notes because it's kind of been really windy. But I guess I started getting into yoga and also mindfulness way back. I probably like almost a decade now when I went to ASU and did my master's with Dr. Timothy McAllister's best. And just kind of getting into yoga because some other people, one of my good friends at the time was doing her doctorate and was researching yoga. So in some ways she was kind of like an inspiration, just for helping with nerves and performance anxiety. And it was just a great thing to do. And so then I started really practicing it at that time. And then when I moved back to Toronto and I was kind of like, oh, well, what am I doing now? I went and took my yoga teacher training. So since then, I've kind of been trying to incorporate it into lessons, but then I often run like workshops, musicians wellness workshops for all sorts of ages. And like I've done a bunch for choirs, for bands, just general musicians, that kind of thing. And yeah, I guess through that, it's really morphed because even though I often like call it yoga for musicians, I wouldn't really say like what I actually do is yoga per se in like a traditional sense. And it's really morphed kind of into just being like general movement and becoming more aware of the body and aware of breathing for relaxation, but also for injury prevention. And sort of throughout the past, I don't know, maybe 5-ish years, I got more interested in injury prevention, partly because, I had started dealing with some aches and pains, and then like all my colleagues were dealing with that. And then I was teaching at the university and like seeing my students. So it's kind of like, it'd be nice to try and figure out how to help my students a little bit more. I started doing a bit more research, and then that led kind of into the doctorate program. And I did my whole thesis on playing related injuries and posture in saxophonists. It was really great. It was a great experience, but at the same time, it's kind of like once you start learning, you realize how much there is to learn. And it kind of just opened up this whole world where like, wow, there's so many different aspects to this. So I'm still very, very interested in research, but I also really am more interested maybe right now in working clinically with not just musicians. So my goal from doing this occupational therapy degree, to be perfectly honest, is to work with a variety of populations. But that being said, I do really think that musicians can benefit from occupational therapy. And one of my supervisors for my DMA program was Dr. Guptill. So I don't know if you know her, but she is an OT and a researcher and oboist and like a really, really awesome advocate for musicians' health. So she kind of introduced me in a way to OT and what that is. And yeah, that's kind of where I'm at now in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's such a fantastic summary, and I certainly don't want to sell short of how incredible of a musician you are. I remember just hearing stories of the legendary Chelsea Shanoff when I was at University of Toronto, and I remember when you came back to do a performance at the music gallery. I think that program was like Des and Chloe, Albright, and a couple of other things. And I remember the moment hearing you playing and be like, this is why we practice long tones. It's just like
Oh my
the
God.
control that you have in your playing. And of course, the way that you carry yourself in performance, I always thought it was just so efficient and just so effortless. And so I've always, this is a treat for me to get to talk to you about this kind of stuff.
I was just going to say that's such a high compliment coming from you. And I really appreciate you saying that. And yeah, I mean, sometimes when I talk about the musician's health thing, I kind of forget to say that like performance is a big part of that. And there were many years where I did a lot of stuff on Barry, which is, you know, a huge instrument. I'm not a big person. And so like, it's really interesting to think about that from a performance perspective too. So yeah. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. And I feel like I relate in so many ways. I'm often the shortest person in the saxophone quartets, but I'm the one that's given the task of playing baritone, and that is certainly when I was much more aware of how my body needed to be ready to play the saxophone, and then just continuing my own wellness journey, having occupational therapists be for me when I needed to deal with tendonitis in my own hands. So very glad that we got to connect. So then I was just wondering then, what are some ways in which your study of yoga and occupational therapy have directly affected your teaching or performing as a active musician?
Yeah, well, I'll talk more about the yoga stuff because the occupational therapy is kind of newer. And I'm just in my first year of it. It's kind of like a separate thing right now. But I guess the biggest thing when I was kind of like thinking about this chat is that for me, like incorporating yoga into teaching, into you know, something that I do for myself before I practice or just on a general basis is all about awareness. And I know that's kind of like often a buzzword to musicians' health, but I think it really comes down to moving your body in like novel ways so that you can become more aware of what your body is doing. I think that's one big component to it, in that so many musicians, I mean, this is not a new thing. Anyone who's interested in musicians' wellness knows that we have this habit of just locking ourselves in practice rooms and practicing, and it's not incorporated. The whole wellness component is not incorporated at an early enough age. I'm very, very passionate about that. And I think that needs to start way, way earlier. But because it's not incorporated early enough in many settings, we don't consider it part of our training. And so we lock ourselves into rooms, we practice, and then you're not aware of what your body is doing. This kind of like cycles into injuries. So for me, using yoga, a tool like both in the practice room and away from it, is literally just to be aware of what your body is doing, how your body's moving, you know, being aware that you have feet. Some people just like totally forget when they're playing, like, you know, it's all here in their mouth and their fingers. And it really is so much more than that, I would say. And so and I think another big component of it is also just a relaxation tool, because there's so much stress in practicing on your own and competition. And so having that breath component, yeah, I think can just be a really useful tool to sort of like slow down and notice what your mind is doing. And yeah.
Yeah, and I love how you're talking about this awareness term and talking about it as a very comprehensive term, in that it's not just a body awareness thing, but it's also this process in which you engage your mind to learn how to relax when tensions are high, or to let go of things that you can't control. I mean, certainly someone that's dealt with performance anxiety as well, it's something that we can't ignore. I mean, so many young students talk about being stage fright.
Totally. And I think as musicians, we know that you need to practice things, right? And so you need to practice, you know, your performance mental state, right? You need to practice to create that awareness. And you can't just all of a sudden be like, okay, I'm going to be aware of what my mind's doing right now. And then having that, like, you need to build up to these things and practice them the same way you practice your scales.
I want to go back to a point that you mentioned about, like, let's start from this basic concept of awareness, in that, like, and the idea that you don't know what you don't know, right? Like you said, that at some point some of us forget that we have feet when we're performing, right? So in your teaching, what are the first principles you might ask a student to think about when talking about wellness? Like, what's a way to sort of get into this sort of mindset about being aware of what's happening in your body?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, it depends on like the individual student and what they're actually dealing with. Or in a lot of cases, they might not have any injuries, which is amazing. So just in terms of like a general student coming in, I just try to incorporate more body movements throughout the lesson. So I'll often, or I guess I'll always have students do some kind of physical warm up and a breath warm up before we begin playing, which is kind of standard anyway. Like most students, I hope, don't just go cold into playing, although I'm sure that still does happen sometimes. But so some kind of warm up, and just asking questions like, okay, what are you feeling now when you're taking this breath? And it's all about asking questions and not dictating what they should or should not be feeling, right? So like when you move your head side to side, what does your neck feel like? When you roll your shoulders, what are you feeling? And it's just by like posing those questions that you become more aware of sensations that exist. And then like going into actually playing, I would often with students do, for example, like scales or long tones or something really easy, but have them do movements at the same time. So things like we would do like shoulder rolls while playing scales. You can get more advanced. You can move your head side to side while you're playing. That's a bit more tricky. Rocking back and forth on your feet, rocking side to side on your feet. So my favorite, which any of my students, I don't know if they love or hate it, is like doing tree pose while doing scales.
Oh,
Not
wow.
necessarily tree pose, but just standing on one leg, because it really teaches you like about your center of gravity and your balance, right? Because you're only on one leg. So it's kind of by doing those exercises, it's both, again, bringing your awareness, but it also, I think the second component when you're like doing movements while you're playing, it takes you out of your head a little bit more. And I think students in particular at a certain age get so fixated on notes and mistakes that they're so focused on that. So it's kind of like trying to bring their attention away from just playing the scale and like, oh, I'm standing on one foot. You're forced not to be thinking about what you're doing because all your attention's going to like try to keep your balance, if that makes sense.
Oh, totally. I love that approach. It's sort of like using a distractor as a way to push that like concerted effort of the technique further back in your mind, so it becomes like a subconscious fluency with this stuff, so that your mind can attend to other things in high stress situations. When we talk about, and like another buzzword in saxophone is like, well, this voicing thing, a lot of students are just unaware of what they're doing with their tongues and whatnot, and then if we amplify that to a much more broader perspective, like what are you doing with your body to enable to get the saxophone to function, I think that's such an important conversation to have, because if we get so fixated up here, we forget about any tension that we're holding here, which will impede technical development. We could be holding tension in different parts of the body that inhibit breathing, which, all of my students know that 95% of the problems I think we find on saxophone have air-related solutions. We've heard it like a billion times on this show. But certainly watching folks like you, I think really exemplify that principle, that a lot of these technical issues that we have on the instrument have solutions that are not like buy this new mouthpiece or get the gold plate your ligature kind of deal. So I wonder if you could maybe provide some tips for students that, like, if they're dealing, like, what are the most common like issues that you see in saxophonists, perhaps. Maybe we can start there.
I think I kind of, when you ask that question, I kind of think back to like my research because I
Yeah.
probably would have answered it differently before. But honestly, I agree with you in that most of the problems, whether they are like finger tension or embouchure tension, all stem back, or not all, 95% stem back to breathing. And I think that kind of is like all encompassing. So one example that stuck out for me when I was talking, I forget who it was that I was, another musician's health expert who I interviewed for my thesis was talking about the example, like if you're, so you're breathing and like we need to use like the muscles around our ribs are super, super important, right? They kind of allow our ribs to move, allow the lungs to fill up and everything like that. And if those muscles are really, really tight and you can't take in a full breath, you're going to try and compensate, right? And so you can't take in a full breath. You feel like you can't put out a full breath. And so you start pushing more. Your body it's really, really smart, and your body tries to compensate. So it might compensate, for example, by tensing up your neck in order to try and squeeze out more air. or might compensate by like really tensing your fingers on the keys because you're trying to squeeze a bit to like get that air out. And I think we all know that feeling of like just kind of, well, I guess wind players know the feeling of like squeezing kind of to try and push the air out a little bit. And so I think there's so much of it does come back to breathing, in that if you're not able to take in a full breath, and also equally important, not able to like exhale with a long exhale and with good air support, then you're going to try and compensate in other ways. The other thing that really stood out for me when I spoke to a lot of these musicians, health experts, is the idea of, and if you studied with Wallace, he was really big on this, the idea of having your feet in a too tight together position, right? And so all coming back to that base of support. If your feet are next to each other, you don't have a good base of support, and that's going to create unnecessary tension somewhere up the chain, right? So just simply moving your feet apart, bending the knees a little bit so they're not locking, that creates like a really good flow from the ground up. And so I'd say like the two biggest tips would be to have your feet not too close together and knees not locking. And then from there, doing more exercises with breathing and having the breath move efficiently. The other super, super big one is just having your head too far forward, right? And so there's the whole analogy that the farther your head moves forward on your neck, the heavier it is, because your spine is no longer in a neutral position. So having more of a neutral alignment with your neck. But to me, that comes back to other things, right? Like if you just try and force your head back, it's not really going to do anything. So it again comes down to like finding a good foot position, working with the breath. And I think a lot of problems come from just teachers dictating how to do things. Mm-hmm. And so someone saying, breathe like this, stand like this, move like this, it creates this, again, this tension, unnecessary tension that is not beneficial. And so I think the biggest tip is that there's not really a right or wrong way to do things, even though I'm contradicting myself by saying, don't have your knees locked and have your feet far apart. There are some basic things, but beyond the basic things, there's not a right or wrong way to be moving and breathing if it's working for your body, if that makes sense. And I think so many times students, especially like classically trained students, we're so used to having everything told, like following directions. We're great at following directions and following what's on the page. And so if a teacher says, okay, breathe this one way, you're going to try and force yourself to do it. When I think more important is figuring out how it works in your body and what it feels like for you, as opposed to what it feels like for this other person.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, which and like reiterating what you were saying before, in that a lot of these wellness tips or advice, it's going to be different for each person. In that, I think you hit the nail on the head that there are these foundational principles, like, you know, having your feet not stuck together will objectively, or sorry, having them spread out further apart will give you a solid foundation. That's like objectively true. And if you're optimizing your breath, it will make your life easier playing the saxophone. That's objectively true. But the ways in which that you do that are individualized for the person. So I love that you're talking about this idea that, you know, your teacher's perspective is of course a valid one, right? Of course, respect your teacher and what they have to say, but just realize that something that works for them is not necessarily going to work for you. And of course, they have your best interests at heart. But if something doesn't feel right, that's usually like a good indicator that, like, okay, maybe we need to like reevaluate and approach this differently. It's not to say that, like, you know, don't listen to your teacher, because that's also bad advice. But
yeah, no, it's exactly what you said. And I think it's not necessarily don't listen to your teacher. You should listen to your teacher, but often we try and jump ahead, right? And so if we're having an issue with something and our teacher suggests maybe it's because our breath is not moving efficiently, and so they suggest, okay, make sure that you're, you know, taking a full exhale by doing XYZ or whatever, we listen to that and we try and do it all really fast. So instead of doing it gradually the way you'd be practicing a piece or a scale, it happens like you go from 0 to 10, and then that's where you create more unnecessary patterns of tension and habits. And so I think it's about like feeling what it feels like for you, but also trying to have the patience. I know it's hard, but when you're working on anything, trying to have the patience to take it really slow and take it baby steps so that you're not adding some other element into the mix.
Yeah, and maybe turning this problem solving session with a teacher and turn it into a conversation so that it ends up being a productive conversation rather than a one-way sort of like do this, do that, and that be the end of it.
Exactly.
Because like in this case with musicians wellness, X plus Y does not always equal Z, for the Canadian folks.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, this wellness journey, I certainly think is such an important conversation to be having with folks like you, and to realize that, while we're talking about this, that there is more than one opinion out there, and you certainly have to do your research. You have to do that experimentation to find what's right for you. It's similar to these principles in music that, this same mouthpiece works for someone doesn't mean it's going to work for you.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was wondering if at this point in the segment we can go into some of these like breathing tips that I think a lot of people would appreciate, just because you're just so well versed in this kind of material.
I guess just to reiterate, the biggest breathing tip is that if someone tells you like there's one right way to breathe, I think that is incorrect. And that might be a taboo thing to be saying, because some people do believe there is like a right way and a wrong way. And yes, if you're one of the people that is like sucking in your stomach when you inhale, like total reverse breathing, you know how some like they talk about when you're feeling anxious, you tend to like suck in and like do that when you're breathing in. And you see that a lot in younger kids who like haven't really thought about it, and they're just kind of if you're doing that, I would maybe say you're breathing incorrectly or inefficiently. But beyond that, like there's this whole thing about the belly breathing, and there for a long time people always are talking about belly breathing from your belly in a very well-intentioned way, but I think it's caused so many problems because it's not anatomically correct. We're not breathing from our belly. And when you focus so much on trying to just like expand your belly when you inhale, I've had so many students come to me and be like, well, I'm not supposed to move my shoulders at all when I'm inhaling, right? And like there's going to be some movement. So it's not like you're trying to hold everything else still and just have your belly move out. That's, I think, maybe more restrictive than it needs to be. So if you're someone listening who's always thinking about breathing into their belly, maybe just switch that thinking a little bit, or like experiment with it. I think remembering that when you inhale, the air is going into your lungs, right? And your lungs are up here. And so when you're inhaling, the air is going into your lungs and it's expanding, and that's pushing your diaphragm, making your diaphragm push your belly out a little bit, right? So it's not, the breath isn't going into your belly, the breath is going into your lungs. So just sort of trying to picture it a little bit, I think can be really, really helpful. Another big tip is to try and focus three-dimensionally. So again, we're really focused on this frontal plane here, but doing things like having your hands on your ribs nice and high, and then when you're inhaling, trying to feel the movement on the muscles around the ribs and even at your back. So to focus more on the sides and the back of your body. And if we do a little breathing exercise at the end, we can do that. And then a third thing that I was thinking about earlier is, and a lot of people talked about this in my interviews for my research as well, is the idea of focusing more on your exhale instead of your inhale. I think we think, okay, I need to take in as much air as I can, right? You take in so much air to play your Albright sonata or whatever you're playing, and then we're not really thinking about the exhale. So when you're practicing breathing, both like with the saxophone and away from the saxophone, really focusing on the exhale component and thinking about it being like a really focused kind of laser beam exhale. The idea of it being like shooting through like a small tunnel. Like it's not, you don't want the air going all out because that's not efficient. So thinking about it being really, really focused and the idea of supporting, like having your whole body support the breath. This is like, I feel like I'm just touching on one tiny, tiny component of breathing, and it is actually very, very complex. And I don't consider myself an expert at all because I've studied with other people who I'm like, oh my God, you've been doing this for so many more years. So yeah, if we can summarize that, exhale, focusing more on the exhale, focusing more on the side and the back of the body, which we can do in our practice, and picturing what the body is actually doing physically inside can be really helpful. Forgetting about belly breathing. And then if if it feels like there's a lot of tension when you're breathing, just trying to investigate where might that be coming from. Again, it could be coming from your foot position. It could be coming from somewhere else. And so again, doing different warm-up exercises where you're like side bending, side to side, front and back, to try and just feel your body and feel the movement, and see if you can think, okay, I feel really restricted in my side muscles here. I'm going to investigate that a bit more. And so like it's always coming back to the awareness piece and what it feels like for you as an individual.
That's such a great summary of all these important points, and I think this foundation of like insight from you is sort of like a launching point for a much deeper conversation about breathing. I mean, I'm certainly not trying to solve the world's problems in, like in one YouTube video. That's not the point. But I think this insight of just building awareness of what tools are available to you is important. And I also want to reiterate the point that if you're feeling like there's an issue somewhere, that might not always be the issue. It's like you were saying, if you have an issue with the way that you're breathing, that your body might be subconsciously compensating somewhere else. And so this idea of like trying novel movements to build an awareness of where this root of the problem is. It's like, slapping a band-aid on a broken arm isn't actually going to fix the problem at its core. But I love that you're talking about, okay, we have this problem, let's see what the true source of the issue is and deal with it from there.
Totally. And I think exactly, like remembering that the body is really smart. We're going to compensate in so many different ways to try and play our instruments. And also remembering that there isn't necessarily like one root problem. Like there could be a variety of different things happening. And then I also just to add, we also don't want to get too fixated on, okay, what is the problem? But I think remembering that, just like you're saying, like novel movements, just moving the body in different ways to move our body, because that's what like our body is meant to do. And so, if you're not feeling good physically one day and you don't want to play, doing some other, like doing a very slow restorative yoga, or doing like a Feldenkrais or an Alexander technique practice where they get really into the mindful part of what your body is doing. Or if you're a gym person, going to the gym and like, I think you go to the gym, workout, whatever, and like doing some of the strength training. I think strength training is super, super underrated for musicians, and it's actually like a really important component. And that's sort of like a whole other thing that, can be talked about another time. But just moving in different ways, and thinking of yourself like the whole idea of like cross training, right? Like you're practicing one day, you're going for a walk the next day, you're going for a swim the next day, and just like, having variety.
Yeah, for sure. And I love how you talk about that. There's like the conversation of fitness as it applies to musicians. It's such a very different conversation, because it's not about like how much you can bench or how far you can run, or like how long you can do a yoga session for. It's a really comprehensive like approach on what fitness means. Like, to be a fit musician doesn't mean that you have to like win all the strength competitions or show to these like ridiculous CrossFit competitions, but it's really a combination of all these aspects of like movement and flexibility, cardiovascular fitness and strength. It's a very subtle blend of all these kinds of things, and certainly something that we
Totally.
can maybe dive into in another segment. I will say strength training is certainly what helped me get over tendonitis when I was ready, so that I was preparing my body for the hours and hours of practice that I needed to do.
Yeah, I think strength training actually can be really helpful. And I think I remember hearing you talk about it in your another podcast where you talked about your tendonitis. But I agree. I've done a little bit of strength training to help with like some shoulder and neck um, tension and pain. And I think it's super helpful because often our muscles are just not strong enough to support the weight of holding the instrument and what we're doing to our body. And we kind of shy away from it because we don't want to further injure ourselves or get hurt. But I think if you're working with the right person to guide you, it can be a really, really useful tool.
Yeah, and I love that point about how working with someone that understands your needs is going to be really important because, like, strength training isn't always about, like, okay, throw on another plate. It's about building this muscle. Like, it's getting these muscles engaged to a point where it's ready to take on the task of what you need it to do. So
Exactly.
certainly we're not all doing strength training to look like the next like Instagram bodybuilders, right? But really engaging the body to prepare it for the task at hand. And I truly believe that performing musicians are the athletes of fine motor skills. So I was wondering if at this point we can transition into that the routine, breathing routine that you were mentioning earlier. All right, so we've transitioned to the mat, and Chelsea is going to lead us through a breathing awareness exercise that she's so graciously offered to help us out with.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So if you and whoever is listening out there want to lie down on your back and just take a couple seconds just to get comfy on your back, there's no need to be looking at the screen. Just you can hear my voice. You can close your eyes if that feels comfortable, but of course, no pressure to close your eyes. If your eyes are open, just have them resting softly so your gaze is kind of soft. And then your hands can start resting at your side or resting on your belly, whatever feels more comfortable for you. Your legs can be straight or your knees can be bent. Again, whatever feels more comfortable for you. And we'll just take the first couple seconds to just become aware of your natural breath. Try to pinpoint where you feel your breath coming and going in your body. No right or wrong answer. So you might feel it coming and going in your belly. You might feel it in your chest. You might feel it somewhere else in your body. You might not feel it at all, and that's okay too. And just start to become a little bit curious. So if you are able to feel where the breath is coming in and out of your body most, where you feel it most, just starting to ask yourself, does the inhale feel longer than the exhale, or vice versa? Does any part of your breath feel really choppy? Do you feel like you're holding your breath at the top or the bottom of your inhale or exhale? And then when you're ready, switch the attention to the back of your body. Really focusing on the back of your body. See if when you inhale, you can feel like your back is pressing down into the floor a little bit more with your inhale. And on the exhale, maybe the back lifts up just ever so slightly. On the inhale, send your attention to your shoulder blades and think about pressing your shoulder blades a little bit more into the floor with your inhale. And then letting them relax with your exhale. And just seeing if you can really be aware of the breath at the back of your body, and having the ground below you is just helping you create that awareness. And then if you take one or both of your hands and place them on your ribs at the side of your body. Now with your inhale, see if you can feel the muscles around the ribs moving a little bit. And just notice what that movement feels like if you're able to feel that. So really focusing on the sides of your body, feeling maybe your sides expand more with the inhale, and then contract slightly with the exhale. And then move your hands back down to the ground just to rest wherever is comfortable, and see if you can keep that awareness of the sides of your body going without the aid of your hands. And then see if in your mind you can really bring your awareness to the side of your body and the back at the same time. So it's like you're really becoming three-dimensional, as we are three-dimensional beings, and really focusing on the back and the side. Maybe feeling a bit of expansion on your inhale and a contraction on your exhale. Again, noticing if the inhale or exhale is longer, noticing any other qualities that you might feel associated with the breath. So some people like to picture a color with the breath or a texture. Noticing if you feel the breath coming and going in any different parts of your body now that a minute or two has passed. And then when you're ready, you can just kind of move your head side to side, move your fingers a little bit, and we'll just come out of this lying down position. So one other thing I just wanted to mention, Jeff, is if your listeners or you are aware of square breathing. Do you know what square breathing is?
No, what's that?
Well, you might know what it is and just not know it by the name, but it's a breathing exercise where you inhale for a certain count. Usually it's about 4. You inhale for a count, hold at the top for that same count. So like you're inhaling for 4, holding for 4, exhaling for 4, and holding for 4. And you just keep repeating that. And I find it usually a really useful tool for awareness of the breath, lengthening both the inhale, exhale, as well as kind of calming down the body, both before a performance or whenever. So just something to mention.
Yeah, that's so great. I think now that you mention it, I have heard something like that in the past, but thinking about this as like, this is a great way to build that awareness of the different parts of the breath, but also realizing that it's a cycle that loops into itself. I think that's such a wonderful tool. Yeah, well, great. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I just want to thank you again. This was such a treat for me, and hopefully folks out there, you found this to be something helpful. So thank you so much, Chelsea, for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. It was so fun.
Yay! All right, well, probably end the recording there, but okay. Thank you so much. That I feel like for me, I just opened up in the shoulders so much more in just that
really?
short amount of time. Like,
I was going to say it was so brief, so it's good. I wasn't sure if it was long enough or not. But.
I was just like lying down and I'm like, oh, this is nice, engaging with this breathing concept again. And then when you mentioned the shoulder blades, I was just like, whoa, you know, like it was just like I was realizing I was just like very tight, and then just learning to let go of that was just or being aware of that, and then just slowly allowing myself to let go was so good. And the way that you we're talking about all these points of access, right? Like I think a lot of people have trouble with meditation because they are like, well, I have trouble focusing on nothing for expanses of time. Yeah. And when you gave those points of like, think of a color or a texture that gives your mind something to focus on, so it's not distracted by like, you know, for me it's always food. Like, what am I going to have for lunch, right? But
that's a good thing to be distracted by.
Oh yeah. Oh good.